The transport ship landed with a deep metallic hum, its engines letting out a hiss that echoed across the docking bay. Among the groups of recruits stepping out was a young human cadet, shoulders squared but heart racing. She clutched her small, packed tightly as she looked around at the new world she had been assigned to. The colony was far from Earth, and even though she had trained for this moment, nothing could prepare her for the sight of so many alien cadets gathered in one place. The Academy itself was massive, carved partly into the rocky cliffs that overlooked a wide valley. The building seemed built to withstand storms and battles, their walls high and dark, with banners of different species hanging along the front. She had seen hollows of this place before, but standing there in person, she felt both very small and very visible at the same time. Her boots clicked against the metal floor as she walked, trying to blend in, though she knew it was impossible. The others were taller, broader, their bodies adapted to environments much harsher than Earth. Some had scales that glimmered under the lights, others fur bristling with the movement of every breath. Many walked with a confidence that came from strength, from long traditions of dominance and hierarchy. The humans were a minority here. Out of the dozens of cadets entering the training hall, only a handful were from Earth. The instructors didn't hide it either. The Academy valued diversity, but everyone knew humans were considered fragile compared to predator species. It was whispered in the corridors, sometimes even said out loud. They break too easily. They're too slow. Not meant for combat. Still, she walked forward, keeping her expression calm. It wasn't that she didn't hear the words or feel the weight of the glances. She just refused to let them touch the core of who she was. She wasn't here to prove humans were the strongest. She was here to show that strength didn't always look the same. The training hall smelled faintly of oil and strange spices carried from other worlds. Large windows showed the red-gold skies outside, where twin suns hung low, their light giving everything a sharp edge. Rows of cadets stood to attention as the head instructor entered. A towering figure from a predator species, eyes sharp as knives. His voice carried like thunder, laying down the rules of the Academy. Discipline, respect, strength, no excuses. She listened carefully, though part of her mind wandered. She noticed how the predator cadets stood in rigid lines, their bodies tense, ready to respond to every command. They thrived on order, on hierarchy. Yet she also noticed the way some glanced sideways at her and the other humans, as if to measure whether they even belonged there. After the introductions, the cadets were dismissed to their quarters. She found her assigned room, plain walls, a narrow bed, and a single window that looked out at the ridge beyond the Academy grounds. She dropped her pack, sitting on the edge of the bed, and let out a slow breath. This was it. The start of a long journey. That night, she couldn't sleep easily. The sounds of the Academy drifted through the walls, the growls of predator cadets settling into their dorms, the clank of armored boots, the occasional hiss or click of alien tongues. It was a chorus of life, unfamiliar, but alive. She pulled her blanket closer and closed her eyes, reminding herself why she was here. Humanity had survived by adapting, by learning, by never backing down, even when the odds were stacked against them. She carried that history inside her. The days that followed were a test of endurance. The first week of training was brutal. Early mornings, long marches under the twin suns, drills that pushed every cadet to the limit. The predators excelled. In raw strength, sprinting ahead, lifting weights twice her size. But she focused on technique, on endurance, on outlasting rather than overpowering. Some of the instructors noticed. They didn't praise her out loud, but they didn't need to. She saw the flicker of respect in their eyes. Still, the other cadets didn't make it easy. She often walked alone to the mess hall, carrying her tray past tables filled with laughter and chatter in languages she barely understood. The predators grouped together, their alliances forming quickly. Humans mostly stuck to themselves, but even among them, she felt a kind of distance. Perhaps because she didn't complain. Perhaps because she kept too quiet. It was during these lonely walks that she first noticed the cubs. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. Small shapes darting in the corner of her vision, shadows slipping between the training grounds and the lower walkways. They were the young of the predator species, not officially part of the academy, but allowed to roam nearby under supervision. Everyone said they were wild, untamable, dangerous if provoked. They were supposed to keep their distance. Yet somehow, whenever she left the mess hall or returned to her quarters, she found eyes watching her. Bright, sharp, animal eyes that followed her steps without blinking. She tried not to react, telling herself it was just her imagination. But the truth was undeniable. The cubs were curious. On the fourth evening, as she walked back under the fading light of the twin suns, she turned her head and saw them clearly. 3 cubs crouched on the ridge above, their bodies low to the ground, tails flicking slowly. They weren't growling, weren't threatening, just watching. She stopped for a moment, her heart beating faster, but she didn't let fear take over. Instead, she simply stood still, letting them see her clearly. She didn't move closer, didn't raise her voice. After a few long seconds, one of the cubs tilted its head, almost as if trying to figure her out. Then, as silently as they had appeared, they slipped back into the shadows. She walked the rest of the way with her thoughts swirling. Why her? Why would predator cubs take an interest in a human of all people? By the end of the first week, whispers had already started spreading. Some cadets had noticed the cubs as well. They don't follow anyone. Strange, isn't it? Why her? The questions floated around her like invisible weight. She didn't have the answers. All she knew was that something had begun. Something she couldn't explain, but that she felt deep in her bones. The academy might see her as small, fragile, out of place. But the cubs had seen something else, and she wasn't sure yet what that meant. She sat by her window that night, looking at the ridge under the starlit sky. The air outside was still, almost sacred in its quiet. For the first time since her arrival, she didn't feel quite so alone. Somewhere out there, sharp eyes were watching her steps. Not with judgment, but with curiosity. Maybe even recognition. And, though she didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of a story that would change everything. For her, for the cubs, and for the academy itself. The days in the academy moved quickly, though each one felt heavier than the last. Training pushed every cadet to their limits. Muscles ached, lungs burned, and every sunrise brought the same routine of drills, sparring, and long marches across the rocky grounds. For most of the predator cadets, it was a chance to show off their strength. They wrestled, competed, and laughed as if pain was just another game. For the human cadet, though, it was about something else. It was about proving, first to herself, that she could endure. She learned to move with patience, to breathe evenly, to save her energy when others wasted theirs in bursts of raw power. And though she never came first in speed or strength, she was always there at the end, standing, still steady when others dropped out. It didn't make her popular, but it made her noticed. But there was something else she had begun to notice, something that unsettled and intrigued her in equal measure. The cubs. They appeared at the edges of her vision more often now. During drills, when sweat blurred her eyes, she'd glance up and see small shapes crouched on the ridges above. During the evening marches, when the sun dipped behind the cliffs, she'd hear soft pads of movement behind her, faint but deliberate. The other cadets laughed when they spoke of the cubs. They don't follow anyone, they said. They're wild, untamed. Yet every evening, without fail, she would find them near. At first, she told herself it was coincidence. Perhaps they were curious about humans in general, not her in particular. But when she looked around, she noticed they never lingered near the others. Not near the scaled warriors, not near the towering hunters, not even near the instructors. Only her. One evening, after a long day of training under the sharp twin suns, she left the mess hall later than usual. Most cadets had already gone back to their quarters, the halls echoing empty with her footsteps. As she walked along the outer path that curved around the academy, she caught sight of them again. 3 cubs perched on a rock ledge above. This time. They didn't retreat when she looked up. Their eyes glowed faintly in the fading light, their bodies tense but not threatening. She slowed her pace, not wanting to startle them, and simply kept walking. When she glanced back a few steps, later they had left the ridge, slipping into the shadows. Yet moments after, she heard soft movements again, this time closer. Her heart raced, but she didn't run. Running would make her prey. Instead, she breathed evenly and kept her stride calm. By the time she reached her quarters, she was certain of it. They were following her. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her mind full of questions. Why her? What did they want? They weren't attacking, and they weren't keeping their distance either. It was as if they were testing something, her reaction, her presence. The next day, during weapons drills, she caught sight of them again. While others focused on target practice, she saw the small heads peeking over the training walls, watching with the same steady intensity. She wondered if anyone else noticed, but if they did, they didn't seem to care. For most cadets, the cubs were just background noise, annoying creatures to be ignored. For her, they were becoming impossible to ignore. That night, she sat on the narrow bed by the window and looked out at the ridge beyond the academy. The stars shimmered above, cold and endless, and she wondered if the cubs were out there right now, watching her again. A strange thought struck her then. She didn't feel afraid anymore. Curious, yes. A little unsettled, of course, but not afraid. The following week, everything changed. It happened after a brutal sparring session. The Predator cadets had been paired up for combat drills, each fight ending when one opponent was forced down. She had been thrown against a taller cadet with thick, scaled arms and eyes full of mockery. He thought the fight was a joke, and perhaps it was. She couldn't match his strength, not directly. Each time she moved, he countered easily, knocking her to the ground again and again. The instructors watched silently, not stepping in. They weren't here to protect her. They were here to see if she could stand, and she did. Every time she hit the ground, she got up again. Her arms shook, her knees scraped, but she refused to stay down. The other cadets snickered, some even whispering, about how fragile humans were, but she blocked it all out. Her focus was on her breathing, on her feet, on the next chance to dodge rather than meet brute strength head-on. Finally, when the session ended, she walked off the mat bruised but upright. That night, as she limped back to her quarters under, the twin moons. She saw them again. The cubs. They weren't on the ridge this time. They were standing on the path itself. Her steps slowed. The 3 of them sat close together, their small bodies still, their eyes reflecting moonlight. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of the cubs padded forward. She held her ground. Her heart thudded against her ribs, but she didn't retreat. The cub stopped only a few feet away, tilting its head the same way it had before, as if measuring her again. Then, with a quiet, almost playful flick of its tail, it turned and padded back to the others. She let out the breath she hadn't realized. She'd been holding. They hadn't growled. They hadn't pounced. They had simply shown themselves. Word began to spread quickly after that. Other cadets had seen the cubs blocking her path, had whispered about how unusual it was. "They don't follow anyone." "Why her?" The questions grew louder. Some cadets laughed at the strangeness of it. Others eyed her with suspicion, but she said nothing. She didn't know the answer herself. The following nights, the cubs became bolder. They no longer stayed on the ridges or behind walls. They appeared, openly, trailing her steps from a distance. Once she even found them sitting outside the training field, waiting until she finished before slipping back into the shadows. She began to notice something deeper. They weren't just following, they were observing, watching how she moved, how she stood after falling, how she never lashed out in anger but never gave up either. They saw resilience where others only saw fragility. One evening, when she finally reached her quarters, she glanced behind her. The cubs had stopped at the edge of the path, sitting in a line like silent guards. For a long moment, they simply looked at her, their eyes unblinking before turning and disappearing into the dark. She sat by her window again that night, her mind racing. The cubs had chosen to follow her, not because she was the strongest, not because she demanded it, but because in some quiet way she had shown them something they recognized. The academy might still see her as fragile, as an outsider, but the cubs had seen something else, something no one else had bothered to look for. And though she couldn't explain it yet, she felt a shift inside her, a quiet strength, a bond beginning to form. This was no longer coincidence. It was the start of something unseen, something the others wouldn't understand until it was too late. And as she drifted to sleep, one thought stayed with her. Predators didn't follow anyone. They chose, and somehow they had chosen her. The cubs were no longer shadows on the ridge. They had become a presence, as real and undeniable as the ground beneath her boots. Wherever she went, they appeared. Not too close, never demanding, but always there. It was clear now they were not merely curious. They were watching her, weighing her in ways no instructor could. The others at the academy had started whispering louder. Some cadets laughed about it, shaking their heads and saying it was nonsense. Others looked at her, with unease, as if the cubs' attention meant something dangerous. But she had no answers to give. The instructors, however, did not laugh. They noticed the pattern and treated it with the same quiet seriousness they gave to every unusual occurrence. They didn't intervene. They didn't chase the cubs away. Instead, they allowed it to play out, as if waiting for something only they could foresee. And then came the test. It was not announced, not planned in the same way drills usually were. One evening, after a long day of combat training, she was summoned to the open grounds behind the academy walls. The sun had slipped behind the jagged cliffs, leaving the sky painted in violet and deep gold. The air was heavy with silence when she arrived, the kind of silence that warned of something significant. Waiting for her were several instructors and a half-circle of cadets. The cubs were there too, crouched at the edge of the clearing, their eyes glowing faintly in the fading light. She felt their gaze on her, sharper than the eyes of any predator. One of the instructors spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "They have chosen to watch you. Now we see if you are worthy of that choice." Her chest tightened. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't tried to make them follow her. But the cubs had made their choice, and now she was being tested because of it. The trial began without further explanation. A predator cadet stepped forward, taller and broader than she was, his muscles rippling as he rolled his shoulders. He was no stranger to her, one of the strongest in the academy, the kind who relished sparring matches because he nearly always won. His task was simple: to challenge her in front of everyone, to see how she responded when all eyes and all cubs were watching. The fight began quickly. He lunged, forcing her to dodge rather than strike. She moved lightly, refusing to meet his strength with brute force. His claws slashed the air close enough for her to feel the wind of his swing. She stayed calm, remembering her training. Patience, breathing, steady movement. The cadets around them cheered, some mocking, some eager to see her fall. But she didn't focus on them. She kept her eyes on her opponent, on the rhythm of his movements, on the way his muscles tensed before each strike. She wasn't stronger, but she was quicker. She let him overextend, made him waste his energy, forced him to fight his own impatience. When he finally tired, she seized her chance. Not with a show of dominance, but with a precise move, sidestepping and hooking his leg just enough to send him stumbling to the ground. She didn't attack when he fell. She didn't need to. She simply stood ready, her breathing steady, her eyes meeting his. She had proven she would not break, and she had done it without cruelty. Silence followed. Even the cadets who had been jeering were quiet. And in that silence, something shifted. The cubs rose from where they had been sitting. Slowly, almost ceremonially, they padded into the clearing. The instructors did not stop them. The larger predator cadet got to his feet and stepped back, his eyes dark with something between frustration and respect. The cubs circled her. They sniffed the air around her boots, brushed their shoulders lightly against her legs, and then sat, in a line at her side. The meaning was clear, even if no words were spoken. They had accepted her. But the test was not over yet. One of the instructors stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Respect is not taken, it is given, and it is earned through restraint. At his signal, another cadet entered the circle, this one younger, smaller, but fierce with pride. His strikes came fast, fueled by desperation more than discipline. She defended herself, blocking when she could, dodging when she couldn't. The cubs growled softly when blows came too close, but they did not interfere. They were watching carefully, measuring her just as much as the instructors were. At one point, the younger cadet overcommitted and left himself wide open. She could have ended the fight in that instant with a harsh strike, but instead she stopped. She raised her hand, showing she had the opening but chose not to exploit it. The instructor's eyes narrowed, studying her decision. The cubs, however, gave their answer first. They padded forward again, this time brushing past the younger cadet without hesitation to stand beside her. The message was undeniable. To them, respect was not about dominance. It was about restraint, patience, and the strength to act without cruelty. The trial ended there. The instructors gave no applause, no words of praise. They simply nodded, as if what had happened had confirmed something they already suspected. The cadets muttered among themselves, some in disbelief, others with growing unease. That night, as she walked back to her quarters, the cubs followed openly. They no longer lingered in shadows or tested her from afar. They walked beside her now, step for step, their small bodies steady and sure. The whispers from the other cadets grew louder, but she ignored them. The only thing she cared about was the quiet certainty in her chest, the knowledge that she had passed their test. When she reached her door, the cubs stopped. They sat in a line once more, watching her as they always did. But this time, their eyes seemed softer, their presence warmer. She understood now. They weren't just following her. They were choosing her, again and again, with every step, every trial. And though she couldn't explain why, she felt the weight of that choice deep inside her. It was more than respect. It was a bond, fragile but unbreakable, born not from strength, but from the quiet strength of being human. The days after the test felt different in a way that was hard to explain. Before, the cubs had been like shadows, always near but never close, watching but never touching. Now everything had changed. They no longer lingered at a distance. Instead, they walked beside her, their paws keeping time with her steps, their golden eyes fixed on her as if she was the center of their small world. It was not just that they followed her, it was how they carried themselves. They weren't being dragged along, and they weren't pretending. They had chosen this place, this bond, and they were proud of it. The first morning after the test, she woke to find two of the cubs sitting right outside her door. Their ears twitched at the smallest sound, and their tails flicked with quiet energy. When she opened the door, they didn't move away or scatter like they might have before. Instead, they rose to their feet and padded beside her, steady and calm, as though they had been waiting all night for her to appear. Walking across the academy grounds that day, she felt the weight of countless eyes on her. Cadets whispered behind, their hands pretending not to stare but unable to look away. Some were wide-eyed with curiosity, whispering that this was something rare, something no one had seen before. Others shook their heads, muttering that it had to be luck, or maybe even some kind of trick. But no matter what they thought, no one stepped in front of her anymore. Not when the cubs walked at her side, their sleek forms silent and watchful, their presence more commanding than words. In training, things shifted even more. During drills, she noticed the instructors paying closer attention to her. They didn't say anything at first, but their eyes lingered when she moved, as though searching for the reason why the cubs had chosen her. When she sparred in the ring, the cubs sat quietly at the edge, their gazes sharp and unblinking. They didn't interfere, but everyone knew they were there. The air felt heavier, the space more serious, as though her every move was being measured, not just by her teachers but by the creatures that had taken her in. The other cadets grew restless. Some avoided her, refusing to meet her eyes, pretending she wasn't there. Others tried to act braver than they felt, smirking and making loud comments as she passed. But none of them dared to push her, not after the way the cubs had stood by. Her in the clearing, not after the silence that had followed. The balance of things had shifted, and everyone could feel it. But it wasn't only about respect or fear. Something deeper was forming, something she hadn't expected. The cubs were not just shadows or protectors. They were teachers in their own way. She began to notice the way they moved together, their unspoken signals, the way one glance or a flick of a tail was enough to guide the others. They didn't need to speak to understand one another. Their trust was built on instinct and presence, and she realized she was learning from that without meaning to. One afternoon, she sat by the training fields, exhausted after drills. The cubs sprawled nearby, their breathing slow, their fur glinting in the fading light. For a moment, she felt a strange connection between them and herself, like she was no longer just a cadet struggling to prove her place. She was part of something larger, something older than rules and ranks. The turning point came quietly, almost unnoticed at first. A sudden alarm broke out one evening. One of the sensor towers on the ridge had picked up movement. Cadets scrambled. Instructors barked orders, and the air was sharp with tension. Everyone moved toward the perimeter, but she didn't rush. The cubs were with her, calm and alert, their heads turning in the same direction. They seemed to sense something no one else did, their bodies tense but controlled. When they reached the ridge, the truth became clear. A group of wild predators, larger, older cousins of the cubs, had come near the academy walls, drawn by the scent of food and the unfamiliar noise. The younger cadets froze, gripping their weapons nervously, unsure of what to do. The instructors shouted for them to hold formation, but the fear was obvious. She felt it too, that sharp edge of fear, but beside her, the cubs stood steady. They didn't flinch or bare their teeth wildly. Instead, they stood firm, their heads high, their stance calm but unyielding. It was not aggression, not panic, but strength. And somehow that strength passed into her. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her voice steady as she called out to the others to hold their ground. Something in her tone cut through the noise, and for a moment, the cadets listened. The wild predators paused, watching carefully, as though recognizing something familiar in the way she carried herself. And slowly, step by step, the danger passed. The predators turned away, fading back into the forest, leaving the ridge quiet once more. The silence afterward was heavier than the alarm had been. The instructors exchanged looks but said nothing, their eyes flicking between her and the cubs. The other cadets whispered, their faces pale with relief. No one could deny what had just happened. She had stood where others might have broken, and she had not been alone. That night, as she sat with the cubs resting around her, she realized the truth. The turning point wasn't just that the cubs had chosen her, it was that she had chosen them back. Their bond wasn't one-sided anymore. It was something shared, something alive, something that couldn't be explained with rules or logic. From that day forward, she wasn't just the cadet who had caught the cubs' attention. She was the one they had trusted, the one who had trusted them in return. And though no one said it aloud, everyone knew it. Things would never be the same again. The ridge, the forest, even the academy itself seemed different now. Quieter, yes, but also filled with a new kind of weight. The cubs had chosen her, but in that choice they had changed everything. And deep down, she understood that this was only the beginning. The lesson was not something she learned in a single moment. It was not written down in a book, nor shouted at her by an instructor. It was something that grew inside her slowly, piece by piece, every day she spent with the cubs. By the time the academy season ended, she knew it was something she would carry for the rest of her life. It began with the quiet mornings. She would step outside before the sun had fully risen, the sky painted in soft colors, and find the cubs already waiting. They didn't need words to greet her. Their steady eyes and calm presence were enough. Sometimes they walked ahead of her, showing her the path. Other times they walked behind, watching over her steps. But more often than not, they walked, right beside her, not leading and not following, but moving as one. That was the first part of the lesson. True strength wasn't about who led and who followed. It was about walking together. As training grew harder, she noticed how easily tempers flared among the cadets. Arguments broke out, rivalries grew sharp, and many tried to stand out by stepping on others. Yet whenever she felt pulled into that storm, the cubs reminded her of a different way. They never fought over who was stronger or louder. They shared space, gave way when needed, and came together when the moment called for it. Watching them taught her that respect wasn't forced, it was earned in silence, through action and consistency. There was one day that etched this lesson deeply. During a long march into the outer ridges, the cadets were tested with heavy packs and harsh terrain. Many stumbled, some grew bitter, and a few even tried to push blame onto others. She herself was exhausted, her shoulders aching, her breath ragged. Yet the cubs moved beside her, step by step, not rushing, not lagging, simply keeping pace. At one point, when her legs almost gave out, one of the cubs pressed against her side, steadying her just enough for her to continue. It wasn't a dramatic rescue, but it was a reminder. Sometimes the smallest support at the right moment could mean more than any grand display of strength. The instructors never said much about her bond with the cubs, but their silence was telling. They watched more closely, tested her with heavier burdens, perhaps to see if she was leaning on the cubs too much. But every time, she rose to the challenge. Not because the cubs carried her, but because they reminded her not to give up. Their presence was not a crutch, but a mirror, showing her what she was capable of when she trusted herself. The whispers among the cadets grew into stories. Some said she had some hidden power, some secret training that made the cubs choose her. Others insisted it was luck, a once-in-a-lifetime event, but she knew better. It wasn't about luck or power, it was about honesty. The cubs had seen her without walls, without pride, without the need to pretend. And in that raw honesty, they had found something worth walking beside. That was another part of the lesson. Trust begins where pretense ends. The turning point on the ridge, when the larger predators had come, was retold many times. Some said the cubs had protected the academy. Others said she had calmed the danger herself. The truth, however, was something quieter and harder to explain. It wasn't about one side saving the other. It was about standing firm together, showing unity when fear tried to divide. That memory stayed with her, replaying in quiet moments, a reminder that courage is not always loud. Sometimes, it is simply refusing to step back when others expect you to. When the academy cycle came to a close, there was a final gathering. The cadets stood in formation, their uniforms sharp, their eyes forward. Instructors spoke about discipline, endurance, and loyalty. Yet when her name was called, the Cubs stepped out from the shadows and stood with her. No one tried to stop them. No one dared. The field fell into silence, and in that silence, she felt the weight of what it meant. She hadn't just earned her place as a cadet. She had earned the right to carry forward something greater than a medal or a title. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the training field, the Cubs around her, the stars stretched, wide above. The air was quiet, the kind of quiet that held meaning. She thought back to the first day she arrived, unsure of herself, just another face in a sea of cadets. She remembered the first time she noticed the Cubs watching. The test. In the clearing, the whispers, the stares. She remembered the ridge, the fear, the choice to step forward instead of back. The lesson was clear now, clear in a way words could never fully capture. Strength was not about standing above others. It was about standing with them. Respect was, not demanded, but earned. Trust was not built in grand speeches, but in silent moments of honesty. And courage was not about being without fear. It was about walking forward even when fear tried to hold you still. When the time came to leave the Academy, she walked through the gates with the Cubs still at her side. Some wondered if they would remain there, tied to the walls and rules of the training grounds. But they didn't. They followed her beyond, past the boundaries, into the wider world. Not because they had to, not because she commanded them, but because they chose to. She knew then that the story of their bond would outlast her days at the academy. People would remember the sight of Cubs walking beside a human, not as pets, not as trophies, but as equals. Some would try to explain it, to put it into reports or theories. Others would call it chance or myth. But she knew the truth. The Cubs had not followed her. They had chosen her. And in choosing her, they had shown everyone watching a lesson that no training manual could ever teach. Years later, long after the days of drills and ridges, she would still think of that lesson. When she stood among others in moments of conflict, she remembered the steady way the Cubs had walked beside her. When she faced choices that pulled her between fear and courage, she remembered the ridge and the silence after. And when people asked her how she had done it, how she had gained such respect, such trust, she would only smile softly and say that she hadn't done it alone. The Cubs may have grown, the forest may have changed, the academy may have moved on, but the lesson lived on, carried forward, not just in her memory, but in the way she chose to live. In the end, it was simple, yet powerful. Real strength is never about walking ahead or behind. It is about walking together, side by side, no matter where the path leads. And so, the story of the Cubs and the human became more than just an academy tale. It became a reminder that bonds built on respect and trust could change the course of things quietly but forever.